Hello and welcome. Today we are going to be discussing the meaning, history, and etymology of the word Carolingian. With the passing of the long-reigning monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, the United Kingdom, as well as its various commonwealths, 15 as of recording, have entered into a new age known as the Carolingian Era, so named as a reference to its new sovereign, King Charles III. In this episode, we are going to be digging into the history and legacy behind Carolingian. And although the word was only first coined in 1881, its lineage is far older and dates all the way back to the predecessors of one of the most well-known and important figures in Europe's history. We will begin by talking about a man named Charles, known colloquially as Charles Martel in Old French, or Charles the Hammer. Charles was the son of the mayor of the palace, the de facto ruler of Francia, a territory which was established by a Germanic people known as the Franks after the fall of Rome in the 5th century CE. This small tribal kingdom began life located near the Rhine and Meuse rivers, but was expanded over the centuries to incorporate areas of what we know today as France, Germany, and Italy, along with a number of other countries, turning it into the largest barbarian kingdom in post-Roman Western Europe. Once the kingdom became too large to be controlled from one central location, it was parceled out into several smaller regions, each ruled by different members of the central reigning family. However, although Charles's father, Pepin of Herstal, held the seat of power over his territory, Charles himself was not the heir apparent to this burgeoning empire, due mostly to questions over his legitimacy, as he was born to a woman thought to be his father's concubine, or possibly his second wife. It is believed that the accusation of illegitimacy stems from Pepin's first wife, who wished to see her own sons ascend to the throne. And indeed, after Pepin's death in 714, she had Charles imprisoned in Caen to prevent him from seizing power. Within a year or so, Charles had escaped prison, and after suffering defeat at the Battle of Caen, he retreated to the Eifel mountain range, which borders the countries we know as Belgium, Germany, and Luxembourg. There he rallied an army of men, and in April of 716 he got his redemption when he led an ambush against those who had defeated him. In this skirmish, known as the Battle of Amblève, he was able to catch his enemies off guard and besiege them from many sides while they rested. Many on the opposing side, surprised by the sudden attack, fled the battle, allowing Charles to claim victory, garnering him notoriety and attracting new followers. This is considered to be a significant turning point in his career, and although this amassing of power occurred during the Merovingian dynasty, it likely laid the foundation of the preceding Carolingian dynasty. Over the next several years, he went on to lead and fight in other battles, as well as secure political alliances in an effort to unite the various kingdoms of Francia under his rule. To do this, he either appointed or acknowledged someone as king in each of the empire's regions, though these kings served as mere figureheads to Charles's power. Towards the end of his career, he divided his empire between his adult sons. This method of division is known as partible inheritance, which is a system that was common among the Carolingians as well as their predecessors, the Merovingians. Charles's eldest sons, Charlemagne and Pepin, jointly reigned over the empire, each taking up the position of mayor of the palace in their respective territories, Charlemagne to the east and Pepin to the west. However, within the decade, Charlemagne retired from his position to pursue a life in servitude of God, making Pepin the sole ruler of the Franks, later taking the title King of the Franks, thus transitioning the position of king from that of a figurehead to a legitimate ruler. Despite the family being the de facto rulers of the Franks for several decades at this point, the acknowledgement of Pepin as king is what signifies the end of the Merovingian dynasty and the dawning of the Carolingian. In order to solidify his position as king, Pepin was anointed by Pope Stephen II in what was the first papal crowning of a ruler ever recorded. And to ensure his throne would be passed down through his family, he had his two sons, Charlemagne and Charles, anointed as well. In addition to acknowledging Pepin as king, the Pope also bestowed on him the title of Patrician of the Romans, a position which effectively designated him as defender of the Church. He spent his life devoting himself to battles of suppression and expansion, dying during a campaign in 768. Upon his death, Pepin's kingdom was again divided between his above-mentioned sons. However, his younger son Charlemagne died a short while after, leaving the entire empire to his brother, Charles, better known as Charlemagne in French, which directly translates to Charles the Great, and it is from here that his English name Charlemagne is derived. The name Charles comes from the Latin Carolus, a name that we will look into a little bit later, and man comes from Magnus, which in Latin means great. Magnus can be traced back to Proto-Italian magnos, itself evolved from the Proto-Indo-European magus, meaning big or great. Charles spent his life in battle, focused on expanding his territory, converting those within his lands to Christianity, and quelling nearly perpetual rebellions that took place in all corners of his empire. Under his rule, there was a period of cultural growth known as the Carolingian Renaissance, which focused heavily on literature and writing. At this point in time, most people, including Charles himself to a certain extent, were illiterate, so this particular cultural flourishing was mainly contained to intellects and clergy. Arguably, one of the most important conventions of this period was the new script known as Carolingian minuscule. This script is thought to have been originally created by the Benedictine monks of Corbie Abbey, a monastery located in northern France, about 150 kilometers north of Paris. Derived from a Roman uncial script, which was written in majuscule or uppercase, the monks adapted the writing system in order to standardize it so that the Latin alphabet used in the Vulgate Bible or Common Tongue Bible could be easily understood across different regions within the empire. Alcuin of York, a scholar and teacher within the court of Charlemagne, worked to further develop this script as his patron came to realize the significance of education, literacy, and communication within his vast territories. In addition to refined, standardized glyphs, Carolingian minuscule also introduced word spacing, lowercase letters, and rules of usage of upper and lowercase letters. The script had an initial reign of about 400 years between 800 and 1200 CE before it was overtaken by Gothic script, and it may have just been lost to time if it weren't for how the script had been used prior to this conversion. If we look back at the core purpose for the development of this writing system, it was intended to be a standardized means of communication and a way to disseminate knowledge across the Holy Roman Empire. To this end, much of what the script was used for was a way to write or copy codexes, religious texts, and educational material. And they produced a great deal of work. It is estimated that there were around 100,000 documents written in Carolingian minuscule in the 9th century alone, and of that, about 6,000 to 7,000 survive today. Because of the neat and legible script, along with the nature of the documents being written or disseminated, the people of the later Italian Renaissance believed the documents to be the original Roman copies, and used them as the basis for the humanist minuscule, which is a script that was passed down over the next few centuries, and through that, Carolingian minuscule actually forms the basis for the current writing system of much of the westernized world. But Alcuin of York is far from the only influential scholar who served Charlemagne. Einhard was a Frankish scholar who joined Charlemagne's court in the 790s while still in his teens. He spent his youth devoted to scholastic endeavors, with an emphasis on the study of Latin, something that we know was of great value to Charlemagne. It seems that the two were relatively close, Einhard serving Charlemagne until the latter's death in 814, after which he continued to serve Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, until deciding to retire in 830. Although we know Charlemagne entrusted Einhard with several projects over his tenure, including overseeing the construction of a number of palaces within the realm, what he is probably best known for is his biography of the emperor, Vita Caroli Magni, or Life of Charlemagne. This work offers an intimate look into one of history's most influential figures, diving into his life and career. The biography is largely considered to be accurate, although historians have noted that the text tends to gloss over or omit certain unfavorable aspects of Charlemagne and his reign, so the contents of the book should be taken with a small grain of salt. Einhard worked closely with Charlemagne throughout his reign, which allowed him access to some of the most significant events in European history, including the coronation of Charles as Holy Roman Emperor. You see, around the turn of the 9th century, the reigning Pope Leo III was attacked by the relatives of his predecessor Adrian I. His attackers attempted to take out his eyes and cut out his tongue, leaving him injured and unconscious. The reason for this attack is not known, though it is speculated that it may have to do with jealousy, ambition, or a lack of faith in Leo III as a spiritual leader. However, with the help of Charlemagne's envoys, he was able to be rescued and transported to Paderborn, a city in modern-day Germany, to seek the protection of Charles himself. Late the following year, Charlemagne sent Leo III back to Rome, and followed shortly after to carry out a meeting with the ecclesiastical council in reference to the Pope, which resulted in his position being restored and those who opposed him being exiled. 2 days later, on Christmas Day of 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charles as Emperor of the Romans, a title which ultimately evolved into the more familiar Holy Roman Emperor in later centuries. Of this event, Einhard explicitly stated that Charlemagne had no idea that he was to be coronated that day, and had he known, he would not have attended the church service, writing, "He at first had such an aversion that he declared that he would not have set foot in church the day that they were conferred, although it was a great feast day, if he could have foreseen the design of the Pope." Though many modern historians dispute this account and believe that Charles was well aware of what the Pope had planned. It should be noted that this move to crown Charlemagne was not without controversy. By proclaiming Charles as Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope publicly illegitimized Empress Irene of Constantinople, the ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, known as Byzantium. Known as the first empress regent in Roman history to ever rule in her own right, a position that she claimed when her son Constantine IV became incapacitated after having his eyes gouged out, which may or may not have been on her orders. Her ability to reign was contested due to the fact that she was a woman, and was therefore considered by some to be unfit to rule. In fact, some of her detractors considered her seat of power to be vacant for this exact reason, and used this logic to support the assumption of Charlemagne as sovereign of a united Eastern and Western Roman Empire. However, this of course was not supported by all. In actuality, there was a lot of opposition between the two competing empires, each claiming sovereignty over the whole. But the title of Holy Roman Emperor remained with the Carolingians for years, until the time when Charlemagne's family line stopped producing worthy heirs, at which point the Pope transferred the title elsewhere to ensure the protection of himself and the Church. This occurred in the late 9th century, when the dynasty was weakened by a lack of legitimate heirs and a few generations of partible inheritance, which had broken the Frankish Empire apart. These territorial divisions led to rivalries among different factions of the empire, and eroded the power of the imperial throne, eventually leading to its dissolution, giving way to the creation of countries such as France and Germany. Of course, the name France itself is derived from Francia, or Land of the Franks, so named for the people at the heart of this expansive but ultimately short-lived empire. Built by Charles Martel and his successors over the course of a century, the Carolingian Empire owes its name to Martel. The name Charles comes from the medieval Latin Carolus, which is derived from Middle High German Karl, meaning man, as in a common man or a man of low birth. Carolingian itself is taken from the French Carlovingian, which comes from the medieval Latin Carolingi, an altered form of an Old High German word Karolinger, which is a word used to indicate that the person or subject is a descendant of Charles, or that they are the family of Charles. This naming scheme was adapted from the previous reigning Merovingian dynasty, so named after their founder Merovech, who was a king of a Frankish tribe in the mid-400s. Charles has been a popular name amongst European royalty for centuries, but the United Kingdom has had somewhat of a shaky past in their previous Carolingian era. Let's take a look. The first monarch of the UK named Charles dates back to 1600. He was the grandson of Mary Queen of Scots and only considered to be a spare until the death of his elder brother Henry, Prince of Wales. He succeeded to the throne in 1625, but was quite unpopular for a number of reasons, some of his own making, and some due to outside forces. Charles believed in the divine right of kings, and with this he felt entitled to rule without accountability to anyone, including Parliament. This was a point of contention between the monarch and the legislative body. In addition to this diplomatic conflict, the country was also facing a financial deficit originating in the reigns of Elizabeth I, as well as Charles's father, King James, an issue which was only exacerbated by Charles's own dealings and skirmishes with Spain and France. By law, Charles himself could not raise taxes without the approval of Parliament, which became impossible when he dissolved the group in order to assume personal rule, which was a period of time known as 11 years of tyranny. However, in 1640, he was all but forced to call Parliament back into session, at which point they began the process of impeaching many of the king's leading councillors under the charges of high treason, as well as passing the Dissolution Act, stating that Parliament was required to convene every 3 years, regardless of the sovereign's will. This set the stage for escalating tensions between the king and Parliament in the following years, eventually leading England into civil war, which culminated in the king being captured and tried for high treason for the crime of using his power to help himself instead of his country. He was found guilty and beheaded at the end of January, 1649. About a week after Charles I's execution, his son Charles II was declared king by a Presbyterian sect of the Scottish Parliament. However, he was still in exile at The Hague in the Netherlands at the time. He did make the journey to Scotland in 1650, but before he could be coronated, Oliver Cromwell led a small army across the border, engaging the Scots in what is known as the Battle of Dunbar and capturing a southern area of Scotland. However, this only served to delay the coronation, and on New Year's Day 1651, Charles was crowned King of Scotland, but the war continued to rage on, eventually leading Charles to become a fugitive king, fleeing to sanctuary in France. In 1658, Lord Protector of the Commonwealth Oliver Cromwell died, passing the title on to his son Richard, who, due to a lack of experience, was not well suited for the role, and resigned shortly thereafter. In this power vacuum, Parliament reconvened and came to an agreement with Charles, known as the Declaration of Breda, where Charles agreed to pardon the crimes that took place during the civil wars for all those who accepted him as their lawful king, with the notable exception of any involved in the regicide of his father. In this agreement, he also pledged religious tolerance and to rule in cooperation with Parliament. Once the agreement was set into place, Charles was able to return and properly rule his nation for the first time. During his reign, he saw Great Britain through plague, fire, and an abundance of religious unrest. He was known as the Merry Monarch, due not only to his tolerance of differing religious groups, but also for his affability, charm, and desire to have a good time. Although opinions on him were quite sharply divided, it seems as though he was endearing but not a particularly effective ruler. He died of a stroke in 1685, ending Britain's previous Carolingian era. Now as we enter a new one, with renewed animosity for the monarchy, it will be interesting to see how Charles III's reign takes shape, and what his legacy, if any, will be. Thank you so much for listening all the way through if you did. Please leave a like if you would like to hear more episodes. Also feel free to leave a comment if there are any other words you would like to see covered in the future.